Hi, this is Philip Anthony Albertelli, and welcome to The Week in Doubt, episode 56. Today's episode is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at www.audibletrial.com/theweekindoubt. Over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, and MP3 player. Phew. Today is a very special episode of The Week in Doubt. I guess kind of like a very special episode of Blossom. This is the first time in the series that I've conducted an interview. People online have been very kind to me. If they've criticized me at all, it's usually constructive criticism. And one of the things I've heard repeatedly is people would like me to add more to the show to make it a little bit more dynamic, perhaps even start doing interviews. So today I conducted my very first interview with Chris Webber, the host of C-Webb Sunday School, and I now present it to you. Thanks for listening. So, for the first time in the history of The Week in Doubt, I'm going to do an interview, and my very first guest is Chris Webber of C-Webb Sunday School fame. And before we get started, I can never remember the Atheist social worker link. So, just so people know where to reach you, Chris, I don't know if you want to throw any links out there or plug anything?
Yeah, I have a couple. I switched from the Atheist social worker to C-Webb Sunday School because my initial idea for the podcast was to do a social worker type atheistic point of view podcast, but I'm not a social worker at the moment. I have a master's in social work, but I'm not a social worker. And so I kind of drifted to more counter-apologetics. So I changed it to C-Webb Sunday School, and that's the URL is cwebbsundayschool.com. I also have cwebbmedia.com where I have a couple satellite podcasts that I host and do. And I also do a paranormal skeptic podcast called Paranormal Skeptic Academy at paranormalskepticacademy.com.
Excellent. I remember I listened to an episode of that, and I really liked that. And we were talking about our mutual love, maybe love's too strong a word, for Brian Dunning's Skeptoid.
Yeah.
But how we were both fans of that. And to some degree, I think that helped motivate us to do our own podcasts. I wanted to offer you a kind of show of gratitude because I think you did something that was brave in a way, maybe something that I wanted to do, but I was just afraid to. And that's just get up the courage to reach out to someone else in the community. I can't remember how far into my own podcast it was, but all of a sudden you reached out to me and kind of welcomed me into the atheist or skeptic podcaster community. And through you, I got to know a whole network of people. There's Dumbass, who, on the contrary, isn't dumb at all. He's actually quite smart.
Yeah, exactly.
Then there's the host of A Matter of Doubt and the Why You're Wrong podcast, too, I believe. And I committed that kind of atrocious faux pas a few episodes back when I confused the hosts of those two shows. But I always wanted to say thank you for reaching out. And I think sometimes people are afraid to take a chance like that because maybe with me, I have my own neurotic internal dialogue where I imagine people are going to be like, oh, I don't have time for you, or I'm too big for you, or whatever.
Right.
And but usually people are pretty darn nice. And I wouldn't have been able to enter that whole network of fellow podcasters if it wasn't for you. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I in this world of podcasting, especially when you're the little guy like us, all you have is networking. So we don't know the big names, we don't know the Anderson Coopers and the Adam Carollas. We just know each other. And so I'm a huge podcast junkie. So I have 43 podcast feeds in my podcatcher, and I reach out to all the skeptic and atheistic ones because we need to build a community. We don't have that community like a Christian community or a Muslim community would have. So reaching out to you, I reached out to Dumbass, I reached out to the Cognitive Dissonance guys, to Why You're Wrong, to A Matter of Doubt. I just put myself out there, and what's the worst going to happen? Someone's going to say no, and stop bothering me. I'm like, okay, cool, I'll go on my merry little way then.
Exactly. That's like, I don't know if she's listening or not. Well, she's obviously not listening now since we're not live. But I have a friend I went to high school with. We were both into music. She was a guitarist, and she ended up becoming a radio host on a local alternative station. And it's funny. I had a couple of people say, "Oh, you have a pretty good radio voice, or you're really passionate about talking about this stuff." So I have kind of this new pipe dream of what would it be like if I could find a little local talk station and maybe they'd give me an hour a week or something. It's a pipe dream. If
Yeah.
nothing comes of it, who cares? But I reached out to her and just asked her, and in my internal dialogue, I thought she might be like, "Do you know how long I had to go to school to be a broadcaster? How dare you, you know?" But
Yeah.
she was the nicest person in the world, and she wrote me back like 7 paragraphs telling me how she got started in the business and all the different hoops she had to go through, and said anytime you need to ask for advice, don't be afraid. So maybe I think it's a good lesson for everyone to remember that we might be skeptics and all,
Right.
but people just as tribal and petty as humans can be, we can also be empathetic and compassionate. And most people have a decent streak in them, and so you should probably never be afraid to ask for a
Well, I
favor.
think it also comes down to passion. When you have a passion for something, you want to share that passion with anybody who'll listen. So when you're dealing with someone who does something for a living, like they're a radio broadcaster, they're not just going through the motions. They enjoy what they do. And when you reach out to them, they feel excited to share that with anybody. And that's why, like your friend sent you 7 paragraphs. She's probably a nice person, but it's also she has that passion for radio, and she loves sharing that. And just like what we do, we don't. I don't think I'm changing the world, maybe one podcast listener at a time, but I have a passion for what I do. And when people contact me and say thanks for the show, I'm very grateful for them. And I respond back to them. I take the time to respond because they take the time to write to me. So I think, it's my duty and it's an honor that you reach out to me. You listen to my voice every couple of weeks, and it's my duty to respond to you. And I'm passionate about it.
Absolutely. I had one guy, probably the first time in a while, someone actually left a review on iTunes, and I'm at 4.5 out of 5 stars now. I think there's 15 reviews in all, and that still blows me away because, I mean, the older I get, the more kind of thick skinned I get. But when I was younger, I was really a sensitive guy and probably afraid to take chances because I didn't want to get rejected or criticized. And I noticed that for as cruel as people can be online, I feel very grateful that most people are very nice. And if they criticize me at all, it's usually constructive criticism. And when this last person, they left me 4 stars, and they said they really liked the show, but they said it can get a little, I don't know if tedious was the word, but listening to just my voice for an hour.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this right now. Because, I mean, I had dreamed from the start of doing interviews, but at the same time, I also want to do it as a kind of a favor for the listener because I want the show to be more engaging and exciting than just listening to one guy for the whole hour. And one thing I've learned with age too is not to be too defensive. And some people, if someone criticizes you and said, "Oh, it's kind of tedious listening to you for an hour," the gut instinct might be to figuratively bite the person's head off. But I,
Right.
I devoted almost a whole show to that one review, and I thanked them for the constructive criticism. And I also offered a kind of tempered or even keel response to each criticism, and explained how I too think I should do different things to make the show be more exciting, but I'm still learning the ropes when it comes to Skype and things like that. And
Hmm.
the person ended up emailing me, and there was a lot of, I think, exclamation marks, and they were just blown away that I took the time to respond to them on the air and didn't attack them for their criticisms. And I responded back and I said, pretty much what you said, that a podcast is usually a labor of love, or it's about a passion for the topic, and it pretty much owe it to people to say thank you
Hmm.
for. You know, I think the biggest nightmare we probably have when we embark on things like this is that no one's listening on the other
Yeah.
end. So when you know someone's listening, it just kind of blows your mind, and it's humbling. You feel like you owe them something, you
Right.
know?
I was talking to Dumbass over New Year's, and we were talking about listenership and how many people listen, this, that, and the other. And when you first start out, you maybe see a handful of downloads and a handful of listens, but as you go on, you gain an audience and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And he said something that was pretty enlightening. He said that like even if you're just talking to 20 people a week, he's like that's a classroom. That's like standing in front
Yeah.
of a classroom and talking to 20 people. So I was like, you know what? Yeah, it's not a point of how many people are listening. It's am I putting out something that's of high quality, and are the people who are listening, are they engaged?
That's true too. Like I think one of the first reviews someone left, and it almost scared me because it showed um, almost. I don't want to insult the listener by saying this because I was very excited by the feedback, but I was almost humbled and frightened by how quickly people are to um, take what someone says for granted, or to accept it as etched in stone truth. Because I think they said something like, well, they said they learned more about religion in one episode than most Christians probably learn throughout a lifetime. And
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know if I'd go that far, but and it kind of reminded me of the duty I have to make sure I have my ducks in a row and that I
Right.
fact
Yep.
check myself. And I usually try to do that if I'm actually kind of neurotic about it, hopefully in a good way. That if I realize I made a mistake in episode, that very next episode, I try to do house cleaning and correct myself. Because another nightmare I have is the idea that someone might be walking around out in the world with a false notion in their head that I put
Right.
there.
Yeah. Yeah, you try to be honest with your listeners. I mean, we're not scholars, we're not experts, we're just a couple of laymen who
Right.
enjoy learning. And I get that from your podcast that you like me, just enjoy learning new things and enjoy finding out how things work. And whether it leads you to atheism or to Christianity or Islam, as long as you're opening the books and you're reading and you're learning and you're listening, I think you're going to be okay.
Yeah, I think as long as you approach things with a spirit of intellectual honesty and almost, this might sound ironic, but kind of have an almost religious reverence for the truth, you
Right.
really can't go wrong. And the worst that can happen is you might slip up, but as long as you fact check yourself and correct yourself to your listeners, there's nothing to really be afraid of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hard, working full time and for me raising a family
Hmm.
and then doing this podcast on the side. So yeah, I'm gonna miss something from some time to time. So I'm not gonna get all my facts correct the first time around. But if you do your diligence, you could mitigate most of those in the beginning. But some things will slip through the cracks. But if you're honest enough and say, I was wrong. Here's the correct information. Sorry about that.
And it's probably still a lot better than the Christian
Oh
fundamentalists
yeah.
who insist that Jesus walked side by side with dinosaurs, or that what we would probably see as parables in the Old Testament are literal truths. And maybe even part of them knows they're not being quite intellectually honest with themselves or the rest of the world, but they stick to their guns. At least we're willing to, correct ourselves and offer a mea culpa.
Yeah, I think what's skeptics, most of us are, we know the limits of our perceptions and our cognitive functioning. So we know that we can be fooled. We get fooled from time to time like everyone else, but
Hmm.
if you're honest with yourself, you can say, look, you know what? Maybe I'm looking at this from the wrong angle. Let me try a different perspective, or maybe my bias is getting in the way here. Sometimes people are stubborn. I'm stubborn from time to time, and I'll
Hmm.
I'll stick to my guns, even if I know I may be wrong. But in the end, I eventually come around to saying, you know what? Like, take for example, fast food. I used to be an advocate of eating fast food, and I get most of my information from the Skeptoid podcast. Brian Dunning did an episode on fast food where it says nutritionally, it's one of the most nutritious meals you can eat because it has everything your body needs, right? So I
Right.
think, yeah, you can go to McDonald's and get a Big Mac meal with a small drink and you have all your nutrition for the day. But the more I looked at it, the more I saw like the sodium content, the fat content, the saturated fats, all this stuff. I'm like,
What else is
yeah,
in there with
yeah,
the nutrition?
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I was like, maybe I'm not quite 100% sure on fast food anymore. And so you start looking at things from a different perspective. You're like, okay, maybe fast food is not as good as I thought it was.
Yeah, there's bread and meat in there, but there might also be ammonia.
Yeah, yeah. Ooh.
You know?
But yeah, and so you just taking the time to re-examine your beliefs from time to time. I don't think believers do that. Like I have a lot of liberal Christian friends
Hmm.
I met during grad school. They were you know pro same-sex marriage. They were pro-choice. They were this, that, and the other. They're everything you would think a liberal progressive person would be. But they still believed in Jesus. And what they would do, what I like to call is buffet belief, they would pick and
Hmm.
choose parts of the Bible that they like, that supports their views, and use that. So I would ask them like, why even need Jesus? Like, why do you need him? What is the threat that keeps you holding on? Is it the threat of hell, the threat of punishment? I mean, there's a ton of other philosophers and even holy, quote unquote, holy men who have espoused the same things Jesus has. Why don't you worship them?
Hmm.
What makes Jesus special? And I think they still have to hold on to that belief that maybe if I'm wrong, that there is a hell and I'll go there.
Isn't what I like to refer to as geographic happenstance. The teachings of the Buddha are probably just as good as the teachings of Jesus, and there's a lot of parallels. But they happen to be born into a Christian culture, so
Yeah,
that's what they
exactly.
latch on to. Now I was going to, yeah, it's funny you use the thread metaphor because I was going to say with cafeteria Catholics or cafeteria Christians, where does it end once you yank that thread? It's like, okay, maybe Moses didn't literally part the Red Sea, or what historians or archaeologists say now that even that may have been a mistake. It was
Yeah, the
actually
Exodus.
the Reed Sea. Yeah, it's like maybe God didn't literally make the all of creation in 6 days and rest on the seventh. Maybe two of every animal weren't really on the ark, but what's to stop you from asking, did Jesus really rise from the dead after 3 days? Where does it stop? It seems like even a lot of enlightened clergy, like I think there's a lot of, especially say like the Church of England. I think even in Catholic seminaries, people are taught that it's not all literal, but they still hang on to the teaching of the resurrection at the
Right.
core,
Yeah.
because without the resurrection, you don't have a religion. And I think it might have been Richard Dawkins who brought it up, where he said that a lot of these kind of cafeteria Christians we're talking about might think that the story of the fall in the garden is figurative, that there really wasn't a talking snake, that Eve wasn't really created out of a rib, that we're really not all guilty of the sins of two individuals magically created. But if you get rid of that, then what was Jesus dying
Yeah.
for? Doesn't
Yeah.
the dogma go, or the theology that Jesus died for the sins of the world to redeem man from the fall in the garden? So if the story of the garden didn't take place, what was the crucifixion all about?
It's interesting that you brought that up because I mentioned that in a couple of my podcasts about, if Adam and Eve were not real and there was no fall, what's the point of Jesus? Because
Right.
there's no need for a savior if there's nothing to be saved from. And also, what I'm fascinated with right now, what my focus is going to be on my next couple episodes, is the early Christian sects within
Mm-hmm.
the first century. And there's this wonderful podcast called the Ancient Religions of the Mediterranean. And it's this biblical scholar. He's a professor at a Canadian university, and he goes through these sections of what the Pauline letters were about, what the Gospels were about, different Christian sects that popped up during the first century. And one of the most fascinating ones, I don't know if you know about them, the Gnostics or
Oh
the
yeah.
or the Marciones. Well, their
Mm-hmm.
belief was that the Old Testament God was a different God than what Jesus was.
Mm-hmm.
They believed that this Old Testament God was kind of this bastard God that screwed up creation,
The
and that Jesus,
demiurge, right?
yeah, and that
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was these higher level knowledge, this higher level God who came to wipe away their beliefs.
Yeah, that's I've long been fascinated by the Gnostics, and I don't. But obviously, I don't believe in the supernatural claims of Gnosticism any more than I do any other religion. But it's just so kind of exotic in compared to traditional Christianity that it's fascinating, and it's kind of a smorgasbord of different spiritual beliefs from around the Mediterranean. And I think it was and you find a parallel in Islam where I believe, well, there was all different Gnostic sects, but generally speaking, they believe that Jesus didn't even really have a physical body and that he was kind of pure spirit, so he never really suffered
Right.
on the
Yep.
cross. And you find that paralleled, yeah, later in Islam. And there's a lot of emphasis on incantation and kind of bizarre symbolism, and almost, I think, probably more of an acknowledgement of the feminine also in the
Yep.
Godhead. But yeah, that's just fascinating
Well, what's
stuff.
also interesting about that too is that this was, the first century. This was supposedly 40, 50 years after Jesus's death. And even then you have a split and divide in what the beliefs are. And here we are going on 2000 years past his death. What makes people more sure today that they weren't 40 years after Jesus died? I mean, you have this the split on, well, you have the Gnostics who believe this and you have the Orthodox who believe this. You even have sects from all over the Middle East with different notions of who Jesus was.
Hmm.
30, 40 years after he supposedly was crucified. And here we are 2,000 years gone.
Well, it is kind of funny when I don't know if you listened to the Easter Redux episode, but it's kind of funny because sometimes I'm reminded of things I said that I forgot about, like little tidbits that I may have
Mhm.
researched at the time. But I mean, I've always known or long known about the Council of Nicaea, but my memory was jogged when I listened back to the episode because, and it kind of reminded me of this. One of the goals of the Council of Nicaea was to settle on a date for Easter, but they also discussed the nature of Jesus. He had a bunch of men. It was a council of bishops discussing how divine was Jesus, how mortal was he one with the Father, and this is stuff we kind of take for granted now. You know,
Yeah,
the notion of the Trinity. So that
right.
shows you a few centuries afterwards, people still weren't even exactly sure or in agreement about Jesus's very nature. And as we said, the Gnostics thought he was, for the most part, a spiritual
Yep,
being.
yep, yep. Yeah, and it's amazing that when you bring this up to a believer in a discussion, they'll always say, well, they were divinely inspired. They were divinely guided by God or the Holy Spirit. You're like, well, I can't disprove that, but you can't prove it. I'm just taking the facts on how they're presented to me, and the facts are showing that the Bible, the books that are in it, are created and put together by man. They weren't divinely inspired. All the evidence points to a very human book.
Yeah, it's two things I always fall back on. Reminds me of how in the Old Testament there's things called doublets where you have multiple accounts of the same event. You know, people think about the story of Noah and they have one narrative in their head, but if you actually sit down with the Bible, you have the story of Noah and the account of the number of animals brought aboard the ark. Then a page or two later, it's a different number of animals,
Hmm.
a certain number of clean, certain number of unclean. Um, and there's, and actually, I think the account of creation itself. I think there's,
Yeah, there's two separate creation accounts.
and then if you go to the New Testament, you know, you have the four Gospels, the three synoptics from the Greek, meaning the see alike, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then you have John, which some people is kind of a more contemplative or spiritual
Yep.
account. And John has Jesus dying on a completely different day. And it's kind of poetry. Jesus doesn't eat a Passover meal. In a sense, he is a Passover meal. He's
Right.
used to represent the Paschal Lamb. He is the sacrifice for the sins of the world. And if it's divinely inspired, Why does Jesus die on a different day in one account? Why are there different account? There's the account of the Jesus weeping in the garden. And I think that's formed from two different separate accounts, and people tend to mash things together. And as Bart Ehrman says, you can feel free to mash the Gospels together as you like, but all you've done there is create your own fifth Gospel.
Right. And
Yeah.
I've heard apologists say that, they're just different accounts of the same event. They use the old, well, two witnesses of a car crash, you're going to see it differently. I'm like, okay, I can buy that argument. And then they'll say like, well, if everything was exactly the same, you critics would be saying these are too similar to be, correct. And now we say, well, they're too different to be correct. Well, now you're saying it's too complicated to be correct. So they try to wiggle out of the final idea of it is that they're different accounts of what Jesus supposedly did. They're presented to different audiences. They're written from different perspectives. Like Mark is written for the reader. The reader, everyone knows what's going on in the story except for the people in the story. That's why the disciples are like bumbling fools in the gospel. They do all these things. Jesus does all these miracles and they still don't see, and Jesus rebukes them. So we're the reader looking at it and saying, "You idiots, you know what Jesus is doing." So it's
Right.
not a historical account in that we would think like history would be written. It was geared towards a Gentile audience to present Jesus as the Son of Man. And then you go to Matthew and Luke, and they're different perspectives. Matthew is more centered towards the Judean Christians, has a more Jewish feel to it. And so once you know these things, you go, okay, it's wonderful we get them in their context of history, but it doesn't prove that Jesus is God.
Yeah, I think there's a scholar that I love named Dominic Crossan. You might be familiar with him. If you've ever watched, like one of my favorite documentary series was From Jesus to Christ. It was a frontline documentary series that was on PBS. And he's kind of an older Irish gentleman, kind of gray hair parted on the side, big glasses. And I think he used to be a priest or a seminarian. And he has an awesome line where he says, either the first Christians intended for the Gospels to be taken literally, and we're so smart we know to take them figuratively, or they were intended figuratively, and we're so dumb we insist on taking them literally now. And he says he agrees with the latter, which I do too. And I think, yeah, if you look back, it's kind of hard for us to comprehend, but that time in history, especially in that part of the world, people weren't obsessed with journalistic like, and not journalistic integrity, because it's not what they were doing lacked integrity. It's just it didn't occur to them to record it as if it was journalism.
Right.
Gospel means good news, and the
Yeah.
idea was to convey the heart of the story. And like you said, the different gospel writers wrote for different audiences. And you can correct me, I might be wrong. I'm trying to think if it's Mark. It's either Mark or Matthew that originally ends with an empty tomb, and it ends on a really dark note.
Yeah, I think that's Mark.
And it was
Mark.
supposed to be because this is when you had people who were still people living in exile, a small Jewish community living in exile. Their Messiah had been crucified, which most Christians probably didn't see coming,
Right.
because in the tradition of the warrior King David, the Messiah was supposed to be a glorious figure. The
Hmm.
worst thing, the most humiliating thing that could possibly happen would be to be crucified. And so they were trying to deal with that sense of loss, that sense of fear. And so there's that dark tone to it. And that's another thing. I think later editors would actually revise the end of that gospel, and I think Jesus ends up meeting the apostles later on a road
Yep.
or something like that. So, and that's really scary when if you listen to someone like Barty Ehrman, who was a born again Christian. I believe he was a pastor,
Hmm.
and just in the spirit of intellectual honesty, though, the more he studied the Gospels, the more he realized how man-made they were, how
Hmm.
much they've been edited. And one thing that blew my mind, I even found surprisingly my heart sink a little when he said that the story of the adulteress being stoned, and the famous line about "let him who be without sin cast the first stone" was
Hmm.
supposedly something added in later.
Yep.
And I was like, wow, because that's a biggie. That's deeply rooted in the Christian gestalt.
Yeah,
That.
definitely. And like I love Bart Ehrman's books. I have majority of them. Actually, he teaches at Chapel Hill, which is right down the road from me.
Oh,
And
wow.
sometimes he gives lectures. I haven't been to one yet, but what I find fascinating is that one, specifically American Christians, they don't realize that the first Christians were Jews, um,
Exactly.
and two, that the Gospels came after Paul's letters. Paul's
Hmm.
letters are prior to the Gospels. So what we know of early Christianity comes from the letters Paul wrote, and Paul is probably the only historical figure we have facts about. Most of his letters, except for the few epistles, weren't attributed to him or weren't written by him. But the early letters of Paul are what we know of early Christianity. The Gospels actually came after the Paul letters. So people will think Gospel first because it's in the beginning, and then Acts, and then Thessalonians, and all down the line. But what we know from early Christianity is the Pauline letters. And from there, you can tell that he was fighting different sects of Christianity, different. He was fighting the Judean Christians because he was a Gentile Christian. And the
Hmm.
Judean Christians were coming into town saying, you need to be circumcised. You need to follow the law of the Torah. You need to do this, that, and the other. And Paul's like, no, all you need to do is believe in Jesus and be saved. So there's even this division among the early Christians on what to believe and how to practice.
That's actually a great point. I think isn't that famous line about how all you need to be is circumcised in your heart.
Yeah.
You don't need the outward markings or the kind of the traditional Jewish trappings or observances. And that's great that you brought that stuff up because anti-Semitism, especially anti-Semitism by Christians, drives me nuts because it makes no sense. It's like you have to try to constantly remind people that Jesus, Yeshua, was a Jewish rabbi, I guess you could say in the modern sense, and that the crowds he preached to would have been mostly, if not completely, Jewish. The apostles were all Jewish. The first Christians Jewish. Paul Jewish. Three out of the four gospel writers Jewish. And I think there's a lot of people that just don't want to hear that because they have a kind of anti-Semitic bent.
Well, especially here in the United States, like I said earlier, it's like the American Jesus. He's this white, blonde hair,
Long hair.
goateed man who, if you look on Facebook for more than 2 seconds, you'll see all the people who post their Jesus loves picture, and he's like a blonde hair, blue-eyed surfer from Southern California. When more
Aryan
than
Jesus.
likely, yeah, he probably looked like Osama bin Laden more than he did.
Exactly. Exactly. That's I've heard that. I've heard that example used before. It's probably inflammatory yet true.
Yeah,
He would have been a very Semitic-looking individual, probably much more Semitic-looking than modern Jews because of the diasporas and so forth. Most people of modern Jewish descent spent a lot of time in Europe. We would have been dealing with ancient Jews who would have been a purely Semitic race.
yeah, exactly. And it's just funny because people create this in their head, and um, it's amazing that they just don't see past their own front door when it comes to religion.
And that did you see any of the Bible miniseries?
I watched that one link I sent you of that guy making fun of it. That was about it.
I didn't even see that. I didn't. I missed that link. What
I'll
was
have
it?
to send it to you. This guy does about a 10-minute rant. He sums up all 4, 5 parts in like 20 minutes and just destroys it. It's pretty funny.
The thing that made my jaw drop. There's a couple of weird things that to be honest, in my own life, I have pretty progressive social values, so I don't give a lot of thought to ethnicity or skin color. At least I try not to. But obviously, historically, certain people were involved in certain things. And I think I joked around on one episode of podcast about how there was a black Samson. and
Yeah.
how well trying to research if who knows maybe there could have been a tribe that was partially of North African descent or something. I don't know, but I found a 70s exploitation movie entitled Black Samson, and I think I also commented on how one of the angels was Asian. And who knows? I mean, angels are mythological figures. Who's to
Yeah.
say what ethnicity they are? But if they're created by in the imaginations of Semitic people, you think they might look Semitic. But the thing that real, and then I think it was they were telling the story of the binding of Abraham and Isaac, and Isaac kind of looked like it looked and sounded like Oliver Twist. And what really got to me is they did the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's it's probably one of the most morally disturbing or offensive stories in the Old Testament, where there's the two disguised angels that
Hmm.
come to Lot's house, and it's bizarre on so many levels. The crowd, there's this crazed mob that demands Lot hand over the two male guests because supposedly they want to have sexual congress with them, and they want to rape them basically, and out of a sense of hospitality, I guess, Lot refuses to turn over the two angels and instead offers up his two virginal daughters, which is, and I think there's another story. Speaking of doublets, there's another
Was that in the
story.
did they show that in the miniseries?
No,
Of
but I was
course
gonna
not.
there's another story in the Old Testament that kind of mirrors that, but Lot's probably the more well-known version, and they completely skipped over it. Lot is actually seen kind of guarding his daughters, and then the angels cast their robes off and they're wearing armor, the Asian armor. I mean, the
Yeah.
Asian angel has like a sword in each hand, and there's this long, drawn out action sequence where he's spinning around, hacking people up. And they don't even hint that Lot might have been thinking about turning his daughters over. And to me, that's just intellectual dishonesty.
Hmm.
And what does it say about your scriptures if there's parts you have to excise because you're afraid people might be morally offended?
And also, right after that scene, doesn't Lot's daughters
They
have
get them
incest
drunk.
and sleep with them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So,
I think some scholars surmise that that, in a weird way, might have been retribution for how he offered them up to the crowd. I've heard some like apologists try to write off the story of Lot as a um, allegory about hospitality. But even if it's that, that's a pretty damn extreme allegory if it involves even symbolically turning one's daughters over to a sex crazed mob.
yeah. Even if you put it within the context, so say most of the Old Testament was said to be written around 7th century BCE. So even 7th century Palestine, it makes sense within the context of history that, obviously women were seen as property, they were
Mm-hmm.
subjugated, so they weren't valued as much as, say, hospitality would be. So it makes sense that he would do that, but to gloss over it and not think that, well, the moral judge of this universe allowed this to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, it's just intellectually dishonest. And I think it's the kind of celebrity power couple of Roma Downey and is it Mark Burnett?
Yeah,
Burnett,
Mark Burnett. Yep.
who are behind it. And if you listen to them, they sound like hardcore, diehard believers. And
Hmm.
my guess is they probably believe in the Bible literally, or at least to a great extent they do. So if you believe in it literally, but still intentionally leave out the more offensive parts, because some part of them is probably telling them something's wrong here, there's something ugly going on. But so it's intellectually dishonest. How do we deal with the ugly parts of the Old Testament? Let's just excise them or ignore them.
Or they'll gloss over and say, "Well, when Jesus came, all that stuff is a moot point now.
Oh
Everything
God, does
changes
that
when Jesus."
that I can't believe I just said, "Oh God," that's kind of ironic, but
Yeah.
that drives me nuts because on the one hand, this is where believers try to have their cake and eat it too. They'll embrace the Old Testament when it suits them, but
Yep.
when you point to the ugliness in it, suddenly we're New Testament people. And I saw someone do that recently on TV with gay marriage, I think it was, where they had no problem falling back on Leviticus
Mm-hmm.
when they wanted to come up with an argument against gay marriage. But when someone brought up something else, maybe it was the slaughter of the Amalekites or something like that, suddenly we're New Testament people.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the God is this objective moral judge, right? And but when you bring these issues up to believers, they say, well, that's all God can do at that time. That's all those people knew. And one of the claims Christians or even believers throw at atheists or non-believers is that, well, you guys are moral relativists. You just go by what the times say is moral. It's like, well, if you really think about it, your God is a moral relativist because if that's all God can do with the people he had at the time that's relevant to their culture, if God was this moral judge, this all-powerful being, he could put something in the Bible that said, don't have slaves, don't have incest, don't do a million other things, don't rape children, don't kill children. He could
Right.
have put that in the Bible, but they say, well, it's just relevant to that culture. So God's a moral relativist too?
Yeah, I forget I think it was Ross Douthat. He's this conservative author, and I might have covered this in the very first episode of the podcast. He was on Real Time with Bill Maher, and Bill brought up some of the ugly things in the Old Testament, maybe like Hitchens would often do, the slaughter of the Amalekites, Moses's proclamation to eradicate the Midianites, and he basically said something about that since humans were capable of evil or doing bad things, it didn't offend him that bad things would be in the Bible. And I didn't really get that at all. It seemed
Hmm.
very bizarre. But yeah, it is amazing the kind of figurative contortionist tricks that believers have to perform to try to make sense of biblical contradiction.
Yeah.
I was going to. It's funny now we're about 45 minutes in, and my original goal was to really have you talk about yourself. But now that we're on this track, before I get into that, I'm not sure how long you have. I did want to ask you what you thought of. There's a couple of Christian apologists who drive me nuts. I think the two biggest offenders are Dinesh D'Souza
Hmm.
and William Lane Craig. And to me, and here I'm going to say intellectual dishonesty again. And when people finally listen to this, they can play a drinking game at home if they want. Every time I say intellectual dishonesty, but it's just unbelievable. And I think that, I mean, there really are classes in apologetics
Yeah.
where people are groomed as to how to try to wriggle their
Defend them.
way out
Yeah.
of reason-based arguments against certain contradictions, whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament, whatever. But what are your thoughts on Christian apologists and maybe specifically Dinesh D'Souza and William Lane Craig?
I I listened to this podcast, Unbelievable. It's out of the UK, and they have either a theist and an atheist, and they'll argue a different point about belief or the Bible. And I've come across several apologists, and I'm getting more into counter apologetics. And I go back and forth with this guy on Twitter. He's an apologist for the Christian faith, and they always trump out these sayings. It's logically consistent. This argument for God is logically consistent, or it makes rational sense, or it's plausible that this could happen. So, well, a lot of things are plausible. Things can be logically consistent and still be wrong. But what I'm after is what's probable. Did
Mm-hmm.
Jesus die and raise from the dead, or did someone steal the body? Both of these could be plausible, but what's more probable? What's more probable is that neither of them happened. He
Right.
wasn't crucified, he wasn't buried, or he didn't exist at all. So what's the more probable explanation? As far as Dinesh D'Souza, I don't particularly care for the man. He's extremely dishonest, especially with that
Yes.
scandal with his wife and his fiance, where they weren't divorced or married or whatever that was.
Family values.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what drives me nuts are these family valued nuts who go out there and thump their Bible about this, that, and the other, and they're walking the Appalachian Trail when they're really in Argentina boning their mistress.
Yeah.
And William Lane Craig, he's a very, very, very smart man,
Right.
extremely intelligent. And a lot of these apologists are. Have you heard of Hugh Ross?
No.
He's one of the forefront for science and Christianity. He's an astrophysicist. He's well trained. He's extremely intelligent.
So kind of
He
like
kn-
Francis Collins, maybe.
yeah, like Francis Collins with DNA and biology. He's with the stars and the universe.
Hmm.
And he believes in the old universe and old Earth, but he also believes that Adam and Eve were literally created as separate beings 10,000 years ago. So here you have this intelligent man who can explain how stars are created, how the universe expands, the Big Bang, all this, that, and the other, down to the minute detail, and then still think that Adam and Eve are special creations. So there's this divide they have in their brain, I
Yeah,
think.
they like compartmentalize. It's
Yeah,
like what were all the
exactly.
where'd all the hominid skeletons come from?
Exactly. And he's like, well, he made this argument that any mammal over 7 pounds uh, can't a mammal can't get bigger than 7 pounds because it won't survive, and so that way it can't evolve into more advanced species.
What the hell?
Yeah, I scratched my head. I haven't had a chance to look it up yet, but I was like, that just doesn't sound correct at all. And so he's like, oh, well, I'm not a biologist, but I'm an astrophysicist. Then he makes this claim about biology. It's like you're
Yeah.
speaking out of your expertise. And a lot of these apologists do that. And like you said, people go to school to defend Christianity. It's called apologetics, apologizing for your faith, defending your faith. They teach you the tricks, they teach you the logical traps, the inconsistencies, and they tell you how to combat those. And I don't think atheists are necessarily schooled in counter apologetics as people are schooled in apologetics.
I mean, this is going to sound really biased, but I was going to say it's probably because the atheist viewpoint or the skeptical viewpoint is the more honest or common sense based one. Even a child can eventually put two and two together and say, how come I don't ever see Jesus? Or how come I don't ever see God? Or they
Right.
can point out, why does the Bible, have two different stories about how many animals? And they're just common sense things that dawn on people when you do a little homework. Whereas in order to defend all these contradictions, you need someone to teach you how to do it because I don't know. I'm at a loss for words. I
Yeah,
get
it's
so
it's
angry.
so let's go back to Bar Ehrman. He wrote a book recently on the historicity of Jesus, and
Hmm.
there's this divide that was Jesus a historical figure, or was he a mythological figure that was made up of different myths and religions around the region at the time? I'm of the belief that there was somewhat of a historical Jesus, in that it wasn't just one person; it was this group of prophets around that time that were kind of conformed into this Jesus
Right, like
character.
a composite, right?
Yeah, like a composite of different prophets and apocalyptic preachers and so on and so forth. I don't think he was a myth, straight out a myth like Zeus or Hercules,
Right.
but I think there was a historical context to him. And so Bart Ehrman was saying, he was arguing with this apologist. He's like, well, are the vast majority of New Testament scholars Christians? And the guy was like, well, most of them are. He's like, no. He's like, the vast majority of them are. He's like, me and a handful of other are non-theist. The rest of them are all Christians. So you
Hmm.
have New Testament scholars who are Christians arguing for Christianity by using the New Testament. So automatically they presuppose God and Jesus are real. So all their arguments for the historical accuracy of the New Testaments are going to be wrapped around in that presupposition.
That's actually an excellent point. So they're kind of working backwards from the point that they kind of have to. Like I said earlier, there might be a lot of modern members of the clergy who don't believe in the miracle stories found in the Bible, or at least most of them, literally, but they can't let go of the resurrection. They
Yep.
they have to hang their hat on that because if that goes, there's nothing left.
Yeah.
But if you
Wow.
think about logically, if you're ready to dismiss other miracles,
Hmm.
why not the big one? You
Exactly.
know?
Yep. And that's when this one apologist I argue with, he says that I asked him about the religious experience of other religions. 1/3 of the population is Christian, so that's out of 6 billion people. That's not a very good rate of return if you think Christianity is the one true religion.
Hmm.
So I asked him, like, so Muslims experience Allah. Hindus experience any numerous number of gods. What about their religious experiences? He's like, well, those are real experiences. We don't discount the experiences of those people. They're just false gods. They're demons.
Yeah, that's convenient.
Yeah, so I scratched my head. I go, what is he trying to say here? And then I figured it out. So what I came up with is if he just automatically says, well, that's just, that's their psychology, that's their physiology, that's their culture,
Hmm.
there's a natural explanation to it. If he admits that, then he also have to admit that maybe his feeling for his God has a natural explanation.
Right. 'Cause
So,
in fairness, that thinking has to be applied to him and his religion as well.
yeah, so he automatically, instead of saying maybe there's a natural reason for why these people believe or feel their God, instead let's just create these, demons and false God hierarchy and say it's just a demon tricking them. But I have the one true religion. There's no demon tricking me.
And I think it might have been Sam Harris who brought up that um, to this day, there's parts of India right now where there's these kind of yogis and holy men that crowds would swear they've seen them perform miracles. Um, when people go there and investigate with a skeptical eye, you can kind of dismantle the tricks and see how they're done. But those crowds would still swear that these are real holy men. And at least thankfully, I think there's even Indian debunkers now, though, who make a kind of living of trying to go around and lift the veil from people's eyes and show these supposed holy men for what they are. And by saying that, I'm not saying that I think Jesus was like some ancient David Copperfield or
Right.
con men, but I think it's a lot easier to get people to believe in the supernatural when it isn't there than you would think. And even if you look into read up on the ancient histories of the first century and a little after and a little before, there were other purported miracle workers. They were kind of a dime a dozen in the ancient world.
Yeah.
And sometimes people of prominence were said to have performed miracles, including Roman emperors, like I think
Yep.
Vespasian, and people like Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus were said to be, quote unquote, the son of God. So it's not just like the quote unquote Christians or the followers of the Jesus movement had a monopoly on miracles.
Well, also it shows itself in the Moses story as well when he's going to the Pharaoh.
Oh
He
yeah.
shows all these divine acts, changing his stick to a snake and so on and so forth. And Pharaoh has his own magicians who do the same thing. So it's not like God is doing something that people wouldn't have known about at the time. He's not doing something that people wouldn't have believed in at the time. So if you put those people in that context in history and they expect miracles to happen, they expect the blind to see and the dead to rise, thinking they saw it or hearing about it is not it's everyday stuff to them.
That's really funny. It brings up some interesting philosophical or theological questions, like in the narrative, who was working miracles on behalf of ancient Egypt? It doesn't make sense that God would be doing it. Why would he be performing miracles for both teams, so to speak? And it makes you wonder if could there have been a time when, say, because obviously monotheism grew out of polytheism,
Hmm.
and I think that there's theories that even Yahweh could have been an old kind of Mesopotamian sky god or war god who at one time might have been part of a pantheon of
Yeah.
gods but became so prominent eventually the move was made from polytheism to monotheism. It makes you wonder if even some ancient believers uh, if maybe they thought there were other gods, but their god was the true god in the sense
The
that he's
God. Yeah.
the one you should follow, the one worth following.
Well, it goes back to that conversation I had with that Twitter apologist. Like I said about other people's religions, they said they're gods. They're false gods, but they're gods.
Hmm.
So he automatically extrapolates that to the Old Testament, where yeah, these different groups of people in that area they worshipped gods who were real, but they weren't the God, capital G.
Yeah, which all of a sudden God has a bunch of buddies. How do you explain that?
Well, and I think the Gnostics, are pretty awesome with the way they manipulated the Old Testament text, especially creation, where it says, "Let us make man in our image."
Hmm.
So it's almost like there's a
Oh,
council of gods.
that's true. And that is mind blowing. I remember the first time I heard that. It's like, how the hell do you explain that away?
Don't you know it's Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, and I think what's the word that you? Yeah, there's a word they use for God. Is it a L or Elohim.
Yeah, Elohim, or it starts with like the preface. It's like an L.
And
Elohim.
it's a word that's sometimes in the Old Testament that's used to refer to Yahweh, but if you look at the etymology of it, it implies a plural usage. Just kind of like the word seraphim
Yeah,
means multiple seraphs. Elohim can mean multiple
multiple
gods.
gods. Yeah,
So what the hell is going on?
yeah.
Well, I guess we would say, hey, it grew out of polytheism.
Yeah, it makes sense to the non-believer. It's like, look, it's nothing special. It's just what these people believed and what they wrote down. And if you have a group of people coming out of polytheism to monotheism, you're going to see these hidden, I wouldn't call them mistakes, but kind of like they're like Easter eggs within the text, where they came from.
For us of the video game
Yeah,
generation.
exactly.
Well, it's funny. Something just popped in my head about William Lane Craig. I remember having a gotcha moment once. I was watching him. I can't remember who he was debating. Oh, actually, I think he wasn't even debating a new atheist. There's this guy named Bishop Shelby Spong. And I don't know if you've ever heard of him,
Mm-mm.
but he is a really interesting dude in that, he's a bishop, he's a priest, but he doesn't believe in the Bible literally. He doesn't believe in a literal resurrection, but he's still a believing Christian. How that works, I don't know.
Yeah,
But if you go on YouTube and look for William Lane Craig and Bishop Shelby Spong, you'll find a debate between them. And Craig was debating from the point of view that the New Testament can be viewed as a collection of historical documents and that there was an actual bodily resurrection. And not the new atheists, the Christian apologists, I was almost going to call them the new apologists. Christian apologists are so skilled at sophistry
yeah,
where you can tell they're not being intellectually honest, but at the same time, you can't get them to give up, so you want to pull your hair out.
yeah,
But at the end of the debate, now I think I've seen him do this with maybe Hitchens or Dawkins too, and it almost makes me sympathetic to William Lane Craig. He admits almost tearfully in this sentimental way how he used to be lost when he was a young man. He was kind of depressed and lost. He didn't really have religion. He wasn't raised religion.
hmm
And then he found God, he found religion, and suddenly all his problems were answered in a
yep,
way. And I'm like, I got you, you son of a bitch.
yep,
No, because I'm like, there it is. You have a need to believe in God,
yes,
and it all works backwards from there. And when I look at myself, like a lot of people want to say that the converse is true for atheists and skeptics, that we're such cynics or sourpusses that we have a need to not believe. And I try to tell people how when I was younger, I wanted to believe more than you can imagine. When I was raised Catholic, I was raised to believe from an early age that God and the devil were constantly warring over my soul. There was a
hmm
God who saw everything I did, and there was a devil constantly trying to lead me astray. And as scary as that thought was, what was even scarier to me was the idea that there might not be a God or that there might not be an afterlife. Because I think for one reason, it was because if you're indoctrinated into this worldview, and at the center of that worldview is a big sky daddy or whatever who gives life
yeah,
meaning, who's going to bestow immortal life on you. You'll never lose your loved ones because you'll all be together in heaven. You don't have to wrestle with your own mortality because your
hmm
individual self is going to live on after the death of the body. When you suddenly realize, or you're on the verge of realizing that that might not necessarily be true, it's nightmarish. I imagine that being raised without religion would probably be much better because I think that to have had faith and then lose it is probably much more damaging to never have had faith at all.
right, yeah,
And I remember when I was younger, I was I think agnostic from an early age, and I started to put two and two together. I realized people use the same tone of voice when talking about Jesus and God as they did when talking about the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. And I started from a young age. I had an interest in mythology, ancient history, religion, things like that. I remember I started watching like Mysteries of the Bible and things like that, and I started realizing the man-made nature of religion. I'd watch documentaries on the Shroud of Turin, and somehow I'd hope against hope that by the end of the show, they'd prove it to be real.
Yeah.
So it's like I wanted to believe more than
Yep.
anything. So don't tell me that I've always been working backwards from the premise that I don't want it to be true. I tried to make it true, but my reason led me elsewhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's definitely. I see a lot of that with the atheists out there who were raised in it, who were indoctrinated in it, and they fell away from it because eventually the reason and logic behind religious belief falls away,
Hmm.
and they just can't hold on to it anymore. And it's a painful process. It's not something that's simple that we just shove off and say, okay, we're done with it. I remember my story is not similar to yours, but I grew up in a pretty much secular house. God was never really talked about. It was more just, you know, you just lived your life. We just struggled day to day just to feed each other and be with each other and have somewhere to live.
Hmm.
And then when I grew up and graduated high school, I joined the army. And when I joined the army, I was like, you know what? Let me try something new. Let me go to church. Let me see what this God thing's all about. So I went to church with some of my friends during basic training. I was baptized. I was actually baptized as a Mormon, believe
Right.
it or not. And so I put my time and effort into it. I became a zealous believer. I was like anti-evolution, anti-science. The world was 10,000 years old. We were living in the end times. Revelation was my favorite book of the Bible because Jesus was coming back, this, that, and the other. I believed in it so fervently that my very core was like, I'm a Christian. This is what I believe. And then slowly I came back down to my base level, my baseline. I was here. I was up. Now I'm back base. I'm like, okay, let me just relax a little bit. I kind of stopped studying the Bible. I kept stopped reading books, counter apologetics books and this, that, and the other books. And then I got married to a very Christian woman, and we started having marital problems. Eventually, we got divorced, and I just stopped going to church. And then I met my now wife, and she was born a Catholic. She just believed in God. She was very socially liberal, so I attracted to her. I told her I was a Christian, and then we got married, and we had kind of a quasi-religious ceremony. She wanted to get married by a Catholic priest, but they said you can only get married in a Catholic church. So she said, "Screw you, I'm getting married outside." And so we got this kind of like this Methodist preacher to come marry us. And then slowly I started to go back into my old ways of thinking, maybe this isn't true. I read Richard Dawkins, I read Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, the whole nine. And then I took a quiz online that said, what do you believe? Like a religious belief quiz. And I was somewhere between like deist and like Orthodox Jew based on my beliefs.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, I was like, this is kind of weird. And then I read the infamous God Delusion, and then that
Hmm.
pretty much sealed my fate. And then I picked up Bart Ehrman's books, and that was pretty much done. But I was like, now I have to tell my wife. We just had a baby. She wants to raise him as a Christian. And I was like, what do I do? For like months, I agonized over telling her. I was like, well, how am I going to tell her? I would lay awake at night thinking like, okay, this is what I'm going to say. This is how she's going to react. Finally, I wrote her a letter. I was out of town for work, and I emailed her the letter to give her some time to digest what I was saying to her. And I came back home, and it was really awkward. She was kind of distant. She was emotional. She would cry at night, thinking of what she lost. Eventually, we sat down, we talked about it, and we came to the notion that she believes one thing, I believe another, but our goals are the same.
Hmm.
It's just how we get there is different.
I'm
Eh,
so glad you brought up all that because what's funny? What you just covered in about 5 minutes is I thought that was going to stretch the entire interview. And so far, we've got to kind of wax philosophical on all this different stuff. And somehow, in a very quick time, you got in your whole, uh, most I imagine, of your own story of how your journey and how you came to be a non believer. And I remember I think it was a Matter of Doubt podcast. I think those guys interviewed you, right?
yeah,
And that's when I first heard you tell your personal story. I remember I was moved by it. And I remember I was very impressed by this is kind of a non sequitur or going off in a different vein by the fact that you had spent time in the military too. And it's because I don't think I admire military service very much, but I don't think I ever had the guts to enlist. So to know that you served in the military, I always found that impressive too. Um, I was going to say something. You were just talking about how your wife had experienced a sense of loss when she found out that you were kind of a non-believer, and you mentioned briefly your child who she wants to raise Christian, and this kind of goes back to what we were just talking about when I was telling my story. Are you ever afraid that if your child's raised Christian, that it might cause undue angst later on down the road?
I would be lying to you if I said I don't worry about it, because it's always in the back of my mind. I have two daughters. One's about to be 5, and the other one's about to be 2.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, and it creeps in. And a funny story though, the other night I was giving him a bath, and I walk in, and my oldest is pouring water over the top of my youngest. I'm like, "What are you doing?" She's like, "I'm baptizing my sister." I was
Oh, wow.
like, "Where'd you hear that at?" It's like, "At church they did that. They baptized her." It's like, "Oh, okay." I was like, "It's like you want them?" I'm like, "No, I don't need to be baptized. I'm good." And so it's like the stuff kids do, like it amazes me, like the way they learn and the way they view the world. Um, and I'm not overly concerned at the moment, just
Mhm.
because, like I said, we have different ways of our paths are different, but the goals are the same between my wife and I. And if my daughters come to me when they're older and they ask me what I believe, I will tell them what I believe. I'll tell them what other people believe. I want to give them a broad view of the world and what to
Right.
expect when you go out into it, because not everyone thinks, looks, and acts like you.
And that's a good point too, because I think the damage that religion does to a child probably also is determined by the extremity of the religious upbringing. Like with me, for instance, I talked about how I was raised with kind of Catholic superstition. Things like Ouija boards, tarot cards, heavy metal music, which I grew up listening to heavy metal music, and I sing in kind of like this heavy metal slash alternative band. And my parents never outlawed it, but everything was seen as a possible portal for evil spirits or this and
Yeah.
that. So, yeah, when you're raised with a strong notion of hellfire and that evil forces might be around every corner, lying in wait, I think that could do a lot of damage. But I guess if you're raised with a more kind of, if this even makes sense, if it's not too contradictory, if you're raised with a more kind of secular brand of Christianity,
hmm
hopefully it's not as damaging, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think we make a couple. I make a couple things clear. I was like, one, I'm not going to talk about my daughters having any type of sin. I
Hmm.
find the idea of sin uh, disgusting. Two, we're not going to talk about any type of hell, because I find that notion as well disgusting. So if you want to take her and you want to teach her about Jesus and you want to teach her about being a better person and pick and choose from the Bible, I'm like, that's fine. But no sin and no hell, because I think those are so damaging to people
Those
that
are the two biggies, I think.
yeah,
If you can excise those, you might have yourself a healthy couple of kids.
I'm hoping. I mean, they're still young and this is a long, long road, but we're just starting out on it.
So what did was your wife cool with that?
Yeah, my wife, like I said, she's a recovering Catholic. So she's no longer a Catholic. And when we met, I told her I disagree with almost everything the Catholic Church does, just based on moral reasons. And she's okay with that. She stopped going to church, and she prays. She has an idea of who God is. She kind of created her own God in her head that kind of fits her upbringing. I'm like, that's
Right.
fine. I don't mind Christians that do that, that they have this own idea of God, their own notion of God, who they pray to, who gives them comfort. It gives her comfort to do that. I don't want to take that away from her.
Right.
I don't want her to change who she is, because that's a part of her. But on the other side, if you have people who take that internal focus of God and externalize it and try to legislate it towards everyone else, that's when I have a problem with religion. That's when I have a problem with believers.
Exactly the same here. As we said, we're both kind of socially progressive, so I believe in individual freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, um, and freedom of expression. And what was I going to say? And I have no problem with people being religious. I just think, on the one hand, it's kind of like an itch that needs to be scratched. Like, if I hear something that's just not empirically or scientifically true, and
Yep.
someone says it like it's the
Yep.
etched in stone truth in kind of this smug way, it just drives me nuts. I mean, I'm not saying the person should be locked up. They're free to believe what they want, but it makes you want to pull your hair out.
Yep.
And I'd say one of my biggest sources for news is probably the Huffington Post. I read the Huffington Post every day, and I don't know why I do it. Maybe it's some kind of form of masochism, but I always read the comments. And when there's a story that has to do with religion, a lot of times you'll have people the Huffington Post is seen as, if it leans either way, it's towards the progressive side. So you'll get a lot of people who kind of share our point of view with a sprinkling of kind of trolling conservatives or Christians in there. And you always get someone who says, like they know it with 100% certainty, you're going to meet God soon, and you're going to have to account for everything you've said and did,
Yeah.
and you're going to have to tell him why you didn't believe it. And I'm like, how the hell can you claim to know that?
Exactly.
It's funny.
I think comments in any of those stories are, yeah, I'm like a masochist too when it comes to that. It's like I usually skip the story and go right to the comments,
Yeah.
especially on like Yahoo. It's like it's so crazy. It's just blows my mind that the way some people think, and then I'll start an argument. I'm like, am I even bothering arguing this? I'm not gonna change this person's mind.
Yeah, I think it's a type of thing where people are so invested in in their beliefs, and they mean so much for them. And like I said, like when I was talking about my own story, how the most nightmarish thing I could conceive of is that there might not be a God or might not be an afterlife. It's funny how resilient the human psyche is, or the personality. I dare not use the word spirit or soul, but even figuratively.
So,
But there was a time when that was absolutely nightmarish to me. And now I'm probably almost on the other side, where I've become so accustomed to being a non believer. I'm like, oh, please don't do anything that makes me believe that there's an afterlife now. I've finally
yeah,
gotten used to the idea that I just don't care. That it's kind of, I think there's a kind of poetry in the idea that maybe we're only here for a brief time. Like, you're kind of a star that flickers and then you're gone. And when I was younger, I think because of my religious upbringing, I thought that if there wasn't a God or an afterlife, even though I was doubting those things, that life would have no meaning, which explains, at least in part, why I spent a lot of my younger years being depressed and angst ridden. And it
hmm
took me a while, but I was eventually be able to come to the conclusion that no matter how we got here, no matter whether or not we have an eternal soul, being alive in the here and now, that has meaning. And it means
hmm
something. And I don't think that the idea that there was some big creator who brought everything into being necessarily adds any more meaning to the equation.
right,
Who is this being? Where did he come from? And there's that problem of infinite regress I see
yeah,
with both science and religion, to be honest. And I'm very not socially, but scientifically, I have a Darwinian worldview. I'm very uh, deeply rooted into the scientific worldview. But I think one problem, like when you try to solve the mystery of where it all came from, I think that science and religion both have to wrestle with infinite regress.
yeah,
Because if you try to go beyond or before the Big Bang, you might have people like Lawrence Krauss, who I greatly admire, who talks about there's this bubbling quantum nothingness, and what we call, famously he wrote the book A Universe from Nothing,
yeah,
and what we call nothingness actually has a weight and has certain properties, and that can help explain how something can come from nothing. And I think the apologists, and I can't believe I'm agreeing with them to some extent, actually have a little bit of ground to stand on when they say that he's kind of playing word games
Yeah.
where if you change the definition of nothing, is it really nothing? So I think people could rightly say, well, where did the primordial ingredients, that hot, dense state of the Big Bang, where did that come from? But Christians, where their problem lies, or religious people in general, if you say to them, well, who created God? If
Hmm.
nothing can, uh, something just can't come from nothing. And they'll say, oh, they'll kind of smugly say, oh, well, God always was.
Yeah.
But how do you know God always was?
Yeah.
And they'll say that Genesis kind of implies it. So
Yeah.
you're evidently man-made book, which seems quite obviously man-made to me. That's where you get your knowledge that God always was.
Yeah.
And so I think both science and religion are plagued with the problem of infinite regress. But the difference is, from creation onwards, science deals in evidence and fact, and religion deals with the suspension of disbelief and wish thinking. You know,
Even if you posit a creator God at the end of the universe, it doesn't necessarily translate to a personal God of Jesus Christ.
it could be anything. And
Yeah.
I used to like when Christopher Hitchens used to talk about, with a twinkle in his eye, that there could be many gods. There could be one God, but he's an evil God. There could be a God and no afterlife. There could be an afterlife and no God.
Yeah, there
There's
could have been a
any,
God who sacrificed himself to create the universe and he's no longer there. His
yeah,
last dying effort was to create the universe.
I've never heard that, but that is one of the
That's
most
that's
awesome.
my that's my own little personal one.
That's one of the best concepts I've heard in a long time. That's actually that's gonna be stuck in my head for a while now.
Good, good.
But but it is true. And if it's funny, if you even look at the ancient world and ancient mythologies and so on, there are examples of people who believe in a god or gods, but not necessarily an afterlife, or that an afterlife isn't guaranteed. I mean, you look at ancient Egypt, and I forget the name of the monster now. It might be Amit, but there's the famous, and I love Egyptian mythology. There's the famous image of the weighing of the scales, where you see Anubis, and he has a scale, and on one side of the scale there's a heart, and on the other scale there's a feather, and there's usually a monster nearby that has like a crocodile head, a lion's body. And the story goes that if the human heart outweighed the feather of truth, then the heart, representing the soul, was thrown to the monster. It gobbled it up, and the soul was destroyed. You cease to exist. And if you look at, like we were talking about hell earlier, which is kind of a foolish, obviously man made notion, and you can see how it evolved. And if you look at the Old Testament, there's not a heck of a lot of mention of the concept of hell. And it's usually, there's a word called Sheol, you hear. And it's a place at the most, the dead are depicted as sleeping. And they could be described as sleeping in a metaphorical sense. And that might explain why, even today, devout Jews don't really spend a lot of time thinking about the afterlife. You don't hear them talking about hell. Um, I think most devout Jews believe in God in a sense, but they're not
Right.
as preoccupied with an eternal life or an afterlife as Christians are. But with Christianity, eventually you see hell, Sheol, and those concepts kind of blossom into and influenced by things like the Greek Hades, and different borrowed notions of hell and the afterlife. I think there's some stuff in the New Testament about Gehenna, which was actually an ancient trash heap where garbage was burned, and that was kind of used as something that could be interpreted as hell. But I'm going off on a rant here.
Well,
But
yeah, I actually did. I did two of my early episodes. One was on hell and the evolution of hell, and I did one on creation myths. So I did five different creation myths from around the world, and just explained how those myths relate to Christianity and the Bible. So if you're interested in that, dear listener, go to cwebbsundayschool.com and look up those episodes.
absolutely. And now, is that your understanding that at some point Greek mythology was kind of mushed up with Christian doctrine or
Well, the
imagination?
the
At least,
concept of hell has a huge influence on Zoroastrianism.
all right.
So the concept between hell and the Christian hell and Zoroastrianism is almost identical. And like I said, I did an episode on that. So if you ever have a chance, go back and either read the transcript or listen to it. And I briefly touch on it, but it explains how those two are so similar that it's almost like they Christianity borrow from it.
Yeah, and dualism too. People don't like to think of Christianity as being dualistic. It's supposed to be a monotheistic religion, but the division between good and evil,
Hmm.
darkness and light. I think it's Zoroastrianism where you have Ahura Mazda, the good force, and Ahriman, the negative, the evil force.
Yep.
And isn't it? I thought there was something about it was said that Zoroaster might have been the product of a virgin birth, or something like that, or there's something like that, a prediction of a virgin birth somewhere in Zoroastrianism.
I don't know specifically.
We'll have to look into it.
Yeah, that'll be something I'll have to do for a later episode.
We'll have to
Maybe that would be
fact
a good
check it
idea.
because we don't
Yeah.
want it to be like Zeitgeist.
Yeah, seriously. Seriously. Well, I mean, we've been going at this for an hour and a half. I think my belly's getting empty and my wife's getting impatient. So I think we should.
Well, yeah, we've been at almost an hour and a half, and hopefully I didn't monopolize things too much. I think
Hey,
we had a
it's your show, so you can
yeah,
monopolize all you want.
but I know I can be kind of long-winded person and sometimes over exuberant when I'm discussing a topic I'm passionate about. But I think we had a pretty good back and forth, and we did manage to touch on your personal story too. And I'm very glad we got around to that because that was initially my main goal of the interview. But we did touch on that.
Well, yeah, I think this is a good conversation. So you can edit however you want to, cut out what you want to cut out, keep what you want to keep. But I think in general, it's always nice to sit down and talk to someone who shares your views. I rarely get to do that.
I think you handled yourself very well. If I do any editing at all, it might be weed out some awkward silences and my usual ahs and ums here and there. But I think for the most part, I'm gonna leave the majority of the content there, and I think I'm going. I might go get something to eat too. Then I'm probably gonna get to editing, and hopefully by tonight, this thing will be on Podbean and iTunes, and I'll actually shoot you an email to let you know when it's up.
Cool. I look forward to it. And let me just plug my stuff one more
Plug your
time.
definitely go ahead.
All right, so the website is cwebsundayschool.com. That's C-Web Sunday School with two S's. You can do one S and it will take you to the same spot. The aggregate site is cwebmedia.com, where I have a couple other podcasts. I also do a paranormal skeptic show called Paranormal Skeptic Academy, where I take paranormal reality shows and dissect them critically. And of course, you can look on the Friends of C web page and you can see all the Dumbass Media Empire and all the other great podcasts that I like to listen to, including this one, The Weekend Out.
Oh, thank you. I was going to say, it sounds like your paranormal show is mostly a critique of other, of kind of debunking paranormal TV shows. But I was going to say, if you ever do topical stuff, do the Shroud of Turin because did you must have seen the news how they recently
The,
revealed it,
yeah.
and supposedly now they're claiming, the carbon dating was pointing towards medieval forgery. Now they're claiming they did new tests. They're saying they did one, two chemical tests and a mechanical test that put it around the first century with an error range of only 200 to 400 years. And I'm anxious to poke holes in that. I wanted to see what you thought. I haven't been able to find much out about the methods they used to test it yet. But I'm hoping it's one of those. Like I said, when I was younger, I was hoping the shroud would be proven true. Now I'm so comfortable as a non-believer. I'm hoping that it's shot down again.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to change my, you know, belief one way or another if they say it's from the first century. I'm like, okay,
Right.
it's still not proof.
My main problem with the Shroud of Turin, all the other evidence aside, and someone brought this up once. It might have been Joel Nichols or one of those debunkers. When they're saying if that shroud wrapped a whole body and then somehow an imprint was left, you shouldn't see a perfect like outline of a front and a back. It should look distorted when you unfold it.
Yeah, almost on top of each other.
Yeah, because you would
Yeah.
see the sides too.
Yeah.
And and the skeptic in question was able to recreate the shroud image or something like it by draping a cloth over a bas relief. And that way, the depth of the body was so shallow, the sides weren't included in the image.
Yeah,
But
there's a whole host of technical reasons why it can't happen, but all the believer has to say is that it's a miracle and God works in mysterious ways.
that's right. And with that, now I'm wondering if I'll leave this little bit in. We'll see.
We'll see.
Now
Like,
with, oh, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say that's maybe for the cutting room floor on a bonus DVD or something.
With that being said, thank you very much. And I mean, sincerely, I enjoyed this conversation too. And I'm honored that you were my first guest. So thanks for helping out.
Well, I'm honored to be your first guest, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you, good sir.
You too, sir. So thank you very much. And with that, peace out.
All right, brother, take care.
You too.
Bye.